Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we will be reviewing the Hacienda Esmeralda Landrace Accession Wash Process Panama from Wes Ngopi. And there's the bag right there. And Wes Ngopi, based out of Shah, Malaysia. And this coffee was featured in a recent blind taste test rankings video where it finished third place out of 5 Wes Ngopi coffees on that day. And this coffee was actually the biggest catalyst and reason for that entire purchase, as I saw this coffee on Wes Ngopi's website and it immediately caught my interest. As I've said in the past, I very much enjoy reviewing non-Gesha Panamanian coffees, and with this one being of an Ethiopian landrace varietal, coupled with the fact that it comes from Hacienda Esmeralda, it immediately caught my interest and is one of the coffees I've been most excited to discuss since the start of this channel. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how it turned out, as this right here is day 48. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which typically indicates a more medium fine grind. However, we went a little bit more fine on that grind as well. Now, roast profile for this coffee, as we've mentioned in the past when it comes to Wes Ngopi, they do roast on the lighter side of things, though this coffee was actually the lightest of the 5 coffees that we are reviewing from them in this series, as it did feel slightly lighter than the other ones that we have discussed up to this point, and we will be discussing from this point going forward as well, which is to say that this coffee does continue to remain on the very light side of things by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 21, blind taste test day, and the cup itself was very much in line with the expectations that we'd had for an Ethiopian coffee, as it was mostly black tea savory dominant with some complementary softer citric tones, including a very slight peachiness to the cup as well, slightly higher than average sweetness to it, but an overall nice start. And obviously the reason I said very much in line with the expectations for an Ethiopian coffee is because this one of course is an Ethiopian landrace, and going into it I fully expected it to act much more like an Ethiopian coffee with maybe a little bit of an above average experience in that regard, as since it had been of Panamanian origin, I did expect that to give it a slight boost. So we'll see how that continued, as on day 24 we opted for the Chemex and it continued to offer more of that savory black tea base, as there's a bit of expected herbality and florality to the cup lingering in the background as well, with more of the soft peachiness as well. Very nice level of clarity, as it's still slightly above average in terms of the sweetness in a slightly more citric sense. So another good day, but once again I had some extremely high expectations for this coffee, so we move on to day 27 as we opted for the April brewer. And it was better today, as there's a nicer sugary sweetness to the cup. The base does continue to remain focused on the listed black tea notes with some complementary citric qualities yet again, but now there is a little bit more of a sugary fruit sweetness to it with a very slight graininess as well. So this is a nice day, and I felt like, okay, we're starting to work with some things. We're starting to see maybe a little bit more potential within this coffee. Day 30 through the V60 with some higher extraction adjustments, and this was by far the best the coffee had been to this point, with much more of the peachiness and white florals present within the finish, and this is definitely what I was hoping for within this coffee, and I said, okay, maybe it'll turn out as good as the expectations that we had had. The base does continue to remain mostly on the savory tea forward side of things, with the entire cup offering a very expected Ethiopian-like feel with a nice bit of intensity. So once again, going into this, I fully expected this coffee to be essentially a very nice Ethiopian coffee, and that's what I'd experienced on this day. When we move on to day 33, as we opted for the Chemex with the same adjustments, and there were some mixed impressions, as on this day the black tea base is the most dominant attribute yet again, with mostly just softness in the rest of the cup. So the florality, the herbality, and just less intensity and sweetness in general, with the cup opening up a lot more on the cool down, plenty of the listed honey this time around, and this is the first time I could say that it was a much more prominent aspect than some of the peachiness that we'd experienced earlier on within this one. Day 36 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and there were some mixed impressions this time around, as it does continue to remain exceptionally clean. That's always going to be expected when it comes to a coffee like this, but the Ethiopian-like feel with plenty of the black tea base does continue to remain the most abundant aspect of this one. There is some primary fruit attributes that are skewed a little bit more towards the citric tone, as the honey aspect is an ever-present quality from this point going forward. Lengthy cool down does yield more peach, though it is something that you do have to maybe seek a little bit more, as opposed to something that might be more pronounced and defined. Day 39 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and it does continue to offer an overall mixed experience as it's sweeter and more lively than some of the earlier Chemex experiences we had, but at the same time it is lacking the desired intensity as the tea-like base does remain the most prominent component, followed by a honeyed florality this time around. So the coffee has started to skew a little bit more in a direction that I wasn't necessarily searching for within this one. Day 42 through the V60 with our standard recipe and a little bit more fine of a grind, and it was a little better. It's still softer than I would like it to be, as it does have a little bit more of a intensity as the cup cools down, but it still focuses much more on the tea-like base and the honey-like attributes to this one. So I was really hoping to get much more of a day 30-like experience from the coffee going forward. However, I did have some difficulty achieving those same highs within this one. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s. Let's go through those, and we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. So obviously this was an extremely clean coffee, and at its very best I was hoping that I was going to score a level 5 in terms of the cleanliness, and I do have to say it's super clean. I think the only reason why it's not justified at that level 5 mark is because none of the attributes in it, most specifically the citric or the peach-like attributes, were overly well defined. If anything, it's the tea-like base that seems to be exceptionally clean and well defined, so that in itself kind of leads to some mixed impressions overall. So leaving it there at that level 4, while it is super clean, it's not necessarily well defined in the manner that I would look for. Finish, level 4. Even then, I have some kind of mixed feelings on the finish, as I do have to say it's probably on the slightly lower side of the level 4. It does leave a very lingering tea-like aspect to it and some slight citric qualities, as well as some very subtle fruit components as well. So mixed impressions in that sense, slightly lower side of that level 4. Florality, level 4, and obviously that's going to be fully expected with a coffee like this, especially in terms of the Ethiopian like floral components that you can experience. A lot of white flowers. Those were maybe some of the less discussed things that were much more prominent in this coffee than we might have insinuated based off of the discussion we've had to this point, but definitely plenty of white flowers throughout the entirety of this one. Citrus fruit, level 4, and as I kind of mentioned, it had a lot more of a generic citric tone to it, especially relative to what I was hoping for within this coffee. A lot of softer lemon attributes to it, which is not necessarily what I was desiring within this coffee. I was definitely hoping for maybe a little bit more robust of some stone fruit-like tones to it. However, it did continue to skew in that sense, and even then at that level 4, it's mostly because this coffee was so soft, subtle, and tame to begin with that the components that were present within this one do feel a little bit more pronounced relative to this tasting wheel because of just how soft and tame this coffee was. Savoriness, level 4. That in itself is probably the biggest surprise to me because this coffee was just so black tea dominant that it did seem to take away from some of the other factors that I was really hoping for within this coffee. Given that just seemed to dominate any of the fruit qualities and even some of the floral qualities that were present within it wasn't necessarily ideal for me, so having that score at the level 4 isn't exactly what I was looking for within this coffee. We move on a handful of level 3s. We'll start with the sweetness, level 3. At the start, I said this is above average in terms of sweetness for an Ethiopian coffee, but for the most part, with the exception of that day 30 mark, I really struggled to get the sweetness to the same level as any of the other coffees that we're going to be discussing from Wes Ngopi. And by the end, I said, I can't really justify a level 4 because this coffee isn't quite that sweet, even if it is slightly sweeter than the average washed Ethiopian coffee. So level 3 is where it went. Acidity, level 3. Once again, continues to be a trend with the Wes Ngopi coffees that we're reviewing, as this one didn't feel the brightest either, so I decided to leave it there at the level 3, and that's probably expected given what this coffee is, Ethiopian Landrace of course, so it could have gone either way, but for the most part, I'm very happy with it being there at the level 3 as it wasn't the brightest. And then the stone fruit there at that level 3 mark, that's what I had the most optimism for. I was really hoping for that to be the most dominant factor within this coffee. Honestly, I was hoping for a level 5 cleanliness. I was hoping for maybe, if I was lucky, a level 5 florality and then like a level 4 in terms of the stone fruit, a lot of peachiness. But the peachiness, once again, a little bit more subtle. At that day 30 mark, it's definitely level 4. But once again, it just was really tricky to replicate that experience. And I have tried. Unfortunately, I just could not get that same sort of intensity from this coffee. Final thing worth discussing is the body at that level 1. So given that this one is, of course, an Ethiopian landrace coffee and is a Panamanian origin coffee, I was maybe expecting it to be somewhere between that 1 and the 2. So having this one score in that mark isn't too surprising, though it is interesting just how tea-like the entire experience of this coffee was, as it is one of the most tea-like experiences we've had from this coffee roaster in general. So as I am looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one had some sky-high expectations going into it. Honestly, when I purchased this coffee, I thought that this could be maybe my favorite coffee that we've ever reviewed, given that it's everything I wanted. It is an Ethiopian landrace coffee. It is a Panamanian coffee, which, even though I've very much enjoyed Ecuadorian coffees over the last couple of years, Panama is still probably my favorite origin. Couple that with the fact that it comes from a coffee roaster that I have very much enjoyed within the last couple of times we've tried them. The expectations for this one were just sky high, and I feel like that's why I didn't end up enjoying this coffee for what it was, mostly because it didn't reach those sky high expectations that I did have. Obviously, a big sticking point for me is going to be not scoring that level 4 in terms of the sweetness, and I feel like I could have worked with the rest had it just reached that mark. But this coffee isn't necessarily overly intense, and I've already heard some feedback from others saying this coffee was a little bit more tricky for them to work with, and they weren't able to get the desired level of intensity either. So unfortunately, I feel like this coffee just wasn't quite what I was hoping for or expecting. Even then, it's still a nice coffee. I do have to say that it's not my least favorite of these Wes Ngopi coffees. I just think it was certainly a victim of some sky-high expectations. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. Honestly, I still feel like it's one of those coffees that a lot of people should give a try, an opportunity to, if you're just interested in what I'm interested in, most specifically non-Panamanian geisha coffees, because it's a very interesting coffee. And even though it just acted like, I want to say for the most part, a pretty standard washed Ethiopian coffee, it's still very interesting to see a Panamanian coffee act that way, even though obviously geishas do tend to act very similar to that manner as well. I just think that it's such an intriguing coffee to begin with that a lot of people should try it. But if I'm focusing in specifically on who I'd recommend this coffee to, people that do enjoy their cleaner, softer, more tea-forward coffees, obviously that's the best experience I had from this one and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Hacienda Esmeralda Landrace Accession Wash Process Panama from Wes Ngopi. Thank you for watching.